there's a unique phenomenon, not found anywhere else in the world. Figures cut in the turf. There are about 30 of them altogether, and the origins of some are quite mysterious. Who cut them, and why? There must be a fascinating history behind these figures, and the evolution of this distinctive chalk landscape. And I want to unravel the origins of the most mysterious figure of all, the Long Man of Wilmington in Sussex. The best-known hill figure is the White Horse of Uffington in Oxfordshire. It's only recently that archaeologists, using a pioneering new technique, have been able to date the horse. The team, led by David Miles, proves that it's prehistoric and at least 500 years older than previously thought.
I suppose the first point that occurs to everybody that you can't make out that this is a horse at all.
No, it looks like an abstract pattern.
Yeah.
Originally the horse was a little wider, so I think that nearly 3,000 years ago you'd have got a better view of it.
How last did it last for this time?
It seems that for nearly 3,000 years local people have looked after it.
There's turfs.
That's only in about 2 years that it's got like that, and then already you can see the grass is colonising. Within a decade, of course, the horse would disappear. So it's important that you keep cleaning it and repairing it.
Nowadays, it's the National Trust that keeps the horse white. But the cleaning or scouring must have been done regularly for thousands of years.
Now, how did you date this horse?
We were excavated down through this chalk, and about 4 or 5 feet below where we're standing, we found the early silts, and we could tell how long they'd been buried.
And what date did you come up with?
We came up with a date of about 800 BC, in other words, the end of the Bronze Age.
So this is the oldest dated chalk figure we've got so far?
It's the only one that we know for definite is really old.
The prehistoric date for the White Horse suggests it was probably made by the same people who built other ancient structures at Uffington. Just a couple of 100 metres away is a hill fort, also constructed around the end of the Bronze Age. So, did Bronze Age communities on the Downs cut other chalk figures? Is the White Horse evidence of an ancient and widespread practice of carving on chalk? A 120 miles away in Sussex, there's another enigmatic chalk figure, the Long Man of Wilmington. According to some claims, this may also have been constructed in prehistory, though no one really knows. A team of archaeologists from Reading University is conducting an investigation to try to settle the age of the Long Man once and for all. The dig's being led by Professor Martin Bell. I went to Sussex to join them.
Many different dates have been suggested in the past for the Long Man. Some people have favoured a Neolithic date. Roman date has also been suggested, but actually the most plausible argument, I think, is really an Anglo-Saxon date, because there's a buckle that was recognised as having a very similar figure, and that belt buckle dates to the 7th century, but others have suggested much more recent dates.
This spread of possibilities covers an enormous time span and shows how little has been known about some of these figures. The Long Man could be as much as 5,000 or as little as 500 years old. The archaeologists were hoping that by dating it, they'd be able to cast some light on just who made this mysterious figure and why. When the figure was first created, they would have dug a shallow trench and packed it with fresh chalk. This would have dislodged material which would have washed down the slope. So the idea was to look for a distinct layer at the bottom of the hill, which might relate to the cutting of the figure and which could be dated.
Quite often when I've looked at these sediments on the South Downs, you find that there are artefacts in the eroded deposits that you can use to date them. You may also be able to date these sediments using the technique which they used successfully at Uffington.
Whilst Martin Bell began the process which should reveal if the Long Man is indeed prehistoric, I set off to explore what it was about this distinctive landscape that might have attracted prehistoric people. It probably wasn't agriculture. The chalk hills don't produce rich, fertile lands. The topsoil is thin. It's best suited for grazing sheep. So was there something else? Was there anything in the geology of this strange rock which might provide the answer? "5 miles from Wilmington, the solid chalk is dramatically exposed in these soaring white cliffs where the South Downs are sliced open by the sea. Here I met geologist Rory Mortimer.
I mean, in a place like this, you were struck by what an extraordinary material chalk is. I mean, what is special about chalk?
It's a very pure limestone, and it gives you these wonderful white cliffs. It's made of material which comes from the top layers of the oceans and sinks to the seabed. So what you're actually looking at here in these white cliffs is an ancient sea floor that's then been uplifted to give you the hills that we call the Downs and the Wolds.
The chalk itself is very soft, but it contains a number of other materials within it, one of which was vital for prehistoric people.
The chalk is full of many things, and one of the key things that everybody notices is these flints, and they're very hard by comparison to this chalk. My hammer will penetrate the chalk easily, but it won't go into the flint. So the flint is an extremely hard, brittle material. And the other aspect of these flints is that they form continuous layers, which we can trace through the cliffs.
There's some one extraordinary dense band there, running right along.
Yes, and that is a flint that we can trace from here across the Paris Basin. I could take you to Dieppe. We'd have a bottle of wine sitting on that flint band.
The same layer.
The same layer.
And of course, that flint, with its remarkable properties, was very useful to early humans.
Only certain flints, though. If you look at this flint, look how nodular it is and separated the nodules are and how cracked it is. That would not have been a very good material to use for example, making tools.
Prehistoric people must have been pretty good geologists then.
Yes, and the extraordinary thing is that the early humans seem to know an awful lot about their flints.
So was that it? People were drawn to the chalk hills in search of flint for tools. I discovered there are still traces of flint mines throughout the chalk landscapes of southern England. But there's only one place in Britain where you can still see exactly how prehistoric people mined flint, and the efforts they went to find the right sort of flint. At Grimes Graves in Norfolk, the ground is pitted with the remains of ancient flint mines, making it look almost like the surface of the moon. I've come here to meet Miles Russell, an archaeologist who's made a study of prehistoric flint mining.
I mean, this extraordinary view here, this landscape, all of these pits are mines?
They are, yes. There's just over 430.
How did they know there was chalk and flint under here?
Well, they also established the flint is in the chalk. There's a lot of flint sitting on the surface. But it's quite a leap of faith to dig the shaft down in the hope of there being nice horizontal seams of flint down there.
Miles took me down one of the pits, which has been re-excavated and restored.
We must be 12, 15 metres down here.
Yes, we're just over 9 metres actually.
Why did they come so deep? I mean, we can see flint lines around here, layers of flint, just as you can on the sea cliffs.
The lowest seams are the best for manufacturing axes and other tools. It flakes beautifully, and it's totally unaffected by any weathering at all.
And how did they dig this?
They dug this primarily with antler picks, which are just naturally shed antlers from red and roe deer.
I was amazed by the ingenuity and labour that would have been involved in digging a shaft like this with just an antler. And I realised that crafting tools from these flints would have been vital for Bronze Age people as they began to shape the landscape around them.
What's the hammer made of?
It's made of quartzite, which is a hard sandstone.
And it's really got an edge on it like a razor.
Chris Lucas has produced a number of tools using the ancient skill of flint knapping.
Boy, and that's got a real heft to it.
It would be very effective.
I mean, you could cut a big tree down with that.
Oh yes, you can cut a big tree down in about 25 minutes.
Stone axes like this must have been produced throughout the Chalk Downs and used in prehistory to create the familiar grasslands that we see today. 5,000 years ago, Uffington would have been thickly forested. Sometime after that, the trees were cleared with flint axes. And just under 3,000 years ago, the White Horse itself appeared on the grassy hillside. There's a clear link between the chalk hills, the flint, and prehistoric people. But what about the meaning of the figures themselves? Why might they have carved a white horse at Uffington? What was the significance of a horse?
These are the Lambourne Downs in Berkshire, where today, famously, racehorses are bred and trained. And barely a couple of miles over there is the White Horse of Uffington. So it's a fascinating thought that horses have been part of this landscape for 3,000 years.
Is it possible that even in the Bronze Age, horses had a special meaning for the people who lived here? I went back to talk to David Miles. He suggested we go to the Bronze Age fort just above the White Horse. The massive ditches and embankments of the ancient hill fort, he told me, are clear signs of a well-organised warrior community.
And the horse was important to them, was it?
This is a particularly important period for horses in prehistoric society. You get the emergence of a kind of warrior aristocracy that's actually mounted and have learned to ride horses.
Were they just functional, or did they have some religious significance as well?
Highly important in religion and in symbolism. They were associated with death and with resurrection. And here the horse is surrounded by the ancestral burial ground, which was in use for nearly 3,000 years.
So the White Horse seems to be linked to a burial ground of the Bronze Age people. In some way it must represent a major statement of their beliefs. I wonder whether this was also true of the Long Man. Why would anyone carve a giant figure holding two staves? I went to catch up with the archaeologists working there before they drowned. Despite 3 days of rain, their trench had progressed impressively.
1.475. Not less than someone's lunch, I think.
Had they found any clues about when the Long Man was constructed? Martin Bell had been hoping that a distinct layer of chalk would show when the figure was cut.
Yes, you're down to the bedrock here.
Yes, very shallow layers, but there's still some really interesting ones. In particular, there's a buried soil along here.
And there's some bits of chalk lying above it.
Yes, it's quite large, angular chalk fragments, and those must relate to quite a significant erosion event on the slope. That could be even the making of the hill figure.
The telltale size and shape of the chalk fragments in this distinct layer could be the key to the attempt to date the Long Man. The chalk itself can't be dated, so the soil immediately underneath it was going to be analysed, using the same technique that produced a date for the White Horse of Uffington. Ed Rhodes from the Research Laboratory for Archaeology in Oxford was about to take a sample.
What we're trying to do is to find out the last time that the grains of sediment were exposed to daylight. So we have to hammer in a tube which keeps the grains in the centre of the tube completely dark.
Ed was hoping that back in the laboratory the grains would reveal the time at which they were buried, and hence when the Long Man was cut. Martin Bell was gathering extra evidence which might give him a broader picture of what had happened here. He was looking for shell fragments of land snails. The different species he found could help to build a picture of how the landscape had evolved. The analysis would take a while, so I was going to have to be patient before getting an answer about the Long Man. But there is one other mysterious chalk figure of a man on a hillside in England. The Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset. Could he tell us any more about the meaning of these chalk men? What set of beliefs lay behind this extraordinary Cerne Abbas giant? What does this flagrantly masculine figure reveal about the people who carved him? Here too, argument rages over the history of the figure. He too has not been definitely dated. As with the Long Man, many people passionately believe that the giant is prehistoric. Historian Joe Betty from Bristol University has made a study of his origins.
What are the rival theories?
The earliest theory is that he was cut by the Iron Age people who lived in this area as part of their fertility celebrations. The second is that he is Roman, and the third theory is that he is Saxon in origin and was built to do honour to the Saxon god Hel or Helith. But I think there is an even better, later explanation for its origin.
Joe took me down to the foot of the giant, to the medieval ruins of Cerne Abbey.
Well, from the 10th to the 16th century, this great wealthy Benedictine abbey owned all the land in this district, including the land on which the giant now stands. And it seems inconceivable that these monks, dedicated to a life of abstinence, prayer, celibacy, would have tolerated a great sexually exultant giant towering above their monastic precinct.
And presumably not just tolerate it, they would have had to arrange to have it maintained, scoured out and so on.
Indeed, quite regularly. And there are extensive records, and I have gone through all these records with great care, and nowhere is there the slightest hint of a giant.
With no trace of the giant in any of the Abbey's records, Joe is convinced that he must have appeared after the Abbey was dissolved in 1539. Our next stop was the Dorset Archive in Dorchester.
Thank you. Now this is the first definite mention of the giant, and it comes in the churchwarden's accounts of Cerne Abbas for the year 1694. Item for repairing the giant. 3 shillings.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
But before that, in 1617, there is a detailed survey of Cerne Abbas, and there is no mention whatsoever of the giant.
So 1617, you believe he's not there. 1694, we know he's there and already needing a bit of repair.
Right.
So how did he get there?
Well, my suggestion is that the giant was created by a man called Denzil Hollis.
Who was he?
Well, Hollis was an MP, but he also owned Cerne Abbas. In 1649, as you know, the king was executed. Hollis was disgusted by Cromwell and all his works, and he was greatly affronted by the Cromwellian supporters who were putting up statues of Cromwell as the British Hercules. And I suggest that he had the giant created on this hillside as a satire on Cromwell.
There are significant similarities between the giant and the statue of Cromwell. Both are naked and both carry a club, but there's a telling difference about the statue.
Of course, it's got a loincloth in the sensitive area.
It has indeed. The giant on the hillside at Cerne is in a state of sexual arousal, and I suggest that this is intended to indicate Cromwell's lust for power, subjugation, dominance over the people of Britain.
Joe's theory that the giant is a satire on Oliver Cromwell will disappoint those who want to believe that the figure is a prehistoric fertility symbol. But the documentary evidence does suggest that the giant was cut in the 17th century. I wondered if this might be true of other chalk figures. Travelling round the downlands of southern England, I discovered that there do seem to be records of when and why almost all the other figures, nearly all of which are horses, were cut. Take the magnificent horse at Westbury. It was cut in 1778, although the records suggest tantalisingly that it may have replaced a much older Anglo-Saxon horse, now lost. The horse at Cheryl was cut in 1780. Alton Barnes, 1812. And the horse at Hackpin Hill was carved to mark Queen Victoria's coronation in 1837. Once you look into it, you realise that although chalk carving definitely started in prehistoric times, there does seem to have been a particular craze for these figures in the 200 years after Cromwell. But it's clear that ever since the Bronze Age people cut down the trees, the downs have been a useful blackboard. Their infertile soil means they've been used for grazing sheep, and over the millennia the closely cropped grass slopes have provided a perfect canvas for making political or religious statements, or for marking celebrations. So where the long man fits into all this becomes a fascinating question. At the moment, the Uffington White Horse is the only confirmed prehistoric figure. Many suspect that the long man could be another. I went to Oxford to see whether Ed Rhodes was getting any results in his attempts to date the long man. The technique he uses is called optically stimulated luminescence, and measures when minute crystals in the soil were last exposed to light. Under yellow light, which won't affect the crystals, individual grains of the samples are placed in the holes in these tiny circular trays. A laser makes the crystals glow, and the amount they glow is proportional to the time they've been buried. Ed was analysing samples of the soil he'd collected, and also pieces of pottery found in the trench. So was the Long Man prehistoric? The results surprised us both.
Overall, combining all the results, we get a mean age of about 1545 AD, which is really very interesting, perhaps a bit different from what we might have expected.
That's quite surprising, really, in some ways. The result from Ed's lab was startling, and at least 1,000 years later than most people would have expected. It placed the Long Man close to the Cernabus giant in time. I wanted to know if Ed's results would be confirmed by the work Martin Bell had done. He was trying to put together a history of the hillside using snails. He can do that because it's known when certain species appeared in Britain and whether they favour woodland or grass. I went back to a wintry Wilmington to find out what the snails had shown.
The different types of snail give you an indication of what the habitat was like at that time.
Yes, in Neolithic times, these hill slopes would have been quite densely wooded, but that woodland was cleared during the Bronze Age. And from the Bronze Age onwards, the sort of short grassland environment which is so characteristic of the South Downs had come into existence.
Remarkably, the evidence from the trench has allowed Martin to picture how this hillside has changed. 5,000 years ago, Wilmington would have looked like this. Then, just as at Uffington, the trees were cleared about 4,000 years ago. There was a brief period of arable cultivation in the Bronze Age, and probably a settlement nearby. But they soon gave up growing crops, and for about 4,000 years it's been grassland, grazed by sheep. And at some time, the figure of the Long Man was cut. Would the snails confirm Ed's date for when this happened? Like Ed, Martin had been looking for dating evidence in the buried soil, the layer immediately beneath the large lumps of chalk washed down when the Long Man was created.
What we've discovered in that buried soil is that it's extremely rich in land snail, and in that land snail assemblage we've got two species. One of them was introduced to Britain in the Roman period, another one in the medieval period. So very much suggests a late medieval to early post-medieval date.
So the chalk lying above the medieval snails must have come down later, sometime after the 13th century. This is certainly consistent with Ed's 16th century date.
So all the different types of evidence are coming together and are pointing to a similar conclusion.
Yes, it was incredibly successful. I didn't expect such an outcome, I must say.
So who built him and why did they build him?
Well, that's really the great puzzle. I mean, there is documentation about the owners of the site and their tenants, but that doesn't throw up any obvious candidates. I think our best guess is that this figure goes with the period of social and religious strife from the Reformation perhaps to the Civil War. And that's where our result is so exciting, I think, because it's consistent with the emerging date for the Cernabus giant in Dorset.
So the two chalk figures that many people thought might be ancient turn out to be the product of a turbulent period of English history some 400 years ago.
We know the chalk landscape was important to people for thousands of years. They needed the flint, which was a key raw material for them. It's obvious that people have been fascinated by these chalk hills down through the ages, and the chalk figures are evidence of that.
They stretch over a period of 3,000 years. But what all these figures, ancient and modern, have in common is that they make use of the steep, smooth slopes of a landscape that was created by early Britons simply with flint tools, the rolling grasslands of the Chalk Downs.